I'd like to ask you, what's the main challenge of education in your country, Australia?
Well, two things really. One is Australia is worrying about its level of productivity. We had very substantial increase in productivity in the 1980s when we opened up our economy, removed trade tariffs, floated the Australian dollar, all of that. And then we had further improvements in productivity in the 1990s with labour market reforms. Now productivity's declined, and there is a sense that the solution this time has to be in education. So there's a drive to improve the quality of education and improve participation in vocational as well as higher education. That's one side. And the other is that we're a federation. We're much smaller than Brazil. We're 22 million people. We're only, one could say, 8 states really. 6 of them are states and 2 are territories, but they're self-governing. And so it's a small country in population. It's big in area. It's almost the same size as Brazil in area. But the question is, why should we develop 8 separate English curricula, 8 separate mathematics curricula and so on? So at the moment we're in the midst of a reform to produce a single national curriculum. And that's all part of, let's use this opportunity to make sure we've got a world-class curriculum.
Talk about the first issue you point out. Are you already dealing with it? What are you doing about that?
Well, there are major programs to try and improve recruitment of teachers, to raise the quality of the teaching profession, to improve teacher education programs, and there's a major drive to improve school performance. I mean, one of the things we're doing, in addition to having a national curriculum, we now report publicly on a website that parents, anyone in the country can see, information on all 10,000 schools in the country. How they perform on the national tests, how they perform in comparison with a set of schools that have students from a similar social background, so they're not unfair comparisons. And you can see now a school that says, look, we're not doing very well, but what do you expect given the students we have? You can say, well, wait a minute, here's another set of schools with the same kinds of students who are doing very much better. So you can learn some lessons from them. All of this trying to drive up performance levels. And in PISA, through the period from 2000 to 2009, our performance declined in reading and in mathematics. Brazil, from a lower base, improved significantly on everything. Now, we started high, we're a high-performing country, but we're going backwards. So this is part of the response to that as well. Although the only things we test all students in while they're in elementary or primary school and secondary school is literacy and numeracy. We don't have examinations until the end of secondary school. So it's important that the teachers assess students in other subjects, that they take everything seriously. They take history, geography, science seriously. So when we write the curriculum, we say this is the content that students are to learn. The way we describe it is we say these are the learning entitlements. The students are entitled to learn these things. And if you're a school, you've got to make sure you give them the chance, the opportunity to learn those things. Now, we don't say how they should organise their teaching. We just say these are the things to be learned. And then we say, and here's what a student who's learned it will be able to do. This is the achievement standard. And to help teachers understand the achievement standards, we've collected examples of students' work. Real tasks set by teachers, real work produced by individual students, and then marked not just by their own teacher, but by other teachers elsewhere in the country. And then we put that on the website along with the curriculum. Our curriculum's not in a book, our curriculum's on the internet. And then along with it goes, here's the achievement standards students should be reaching, and here are examples of students' work. This one's really good, it's worth an A. This one's worth a C, and the reason it didn't get an A is, and there's an explanation of that. So this all helps teachers consistently assess across the country.
Professor, what about the money? Australia spend a lot of money on education, and how important it is to have a lot of money to get a better education?
Well, finance is important, but one of the things that people noticed when the first PISA results were produced by OECD was that the best countries were not necessarily the ones that spent the most. And two countries that were very interested were Finland and Denmark. Scandinavian countries look at one another. Now, Finland was at the top in achievement and at the average in expenditure per student. Denmark was at the top in expenditure, almost at the top, and at the average in achievement. So Denmark was spending a whole lot more than Finland, but Finland was doing a whole lot better.
How could we explain that?
Oh, it's a question of how effectively the money is used. We've increased expenditure in Australia substantially, but much of it has just been consumed by making classes a bit smaller. You decide to make classes, suppose you want to make all the classes across the country less than 25 instead of less than 30. You've got to hire a whole lot of teachers at very great expense, and decreasing class size in that range has almost no effect on student learning. So if you want to waste money, reduce class size. Now, if you've got very big classes, of course, then it does make sense to bring them down. But in the range where we've been reducing class size, it has had no effect on student learning and a huge effect on expenditure.
Where is the best place to put the money? If you have a lot of money, you have to decide where to put it. Where's the better place, or how to, manage the money a little bit here, a little bit there?
Well, I mean, I think that the crucial factor, the most important factor in the quality of school education is the teachers. So I'd invest the money in obtaining quality teachers, not just in obtaining more teachers. Now, you've got to have a sufficient number, but beyond that, I'd worry about quality. And at least in Australia, the starting salary for teachers is not bad. If you finish university and you become a teacher, you start on a reasonable salary. But you reach your maximum salary within 9 years. Now, and furthermore, the maximum is less than double the starting salary. So what other profession do you enter and your lifetime maximum is reached before you're 30 and it's less than double what you started on? It's no wonder teachers leave. Well, change is always controversial. Our teachers, I think, are very motivated, but accountability programs, when they're put in place with assessment practices that other people are imposing, teachers sometimes react negatively to those. But we've been doing that now for a long time. The first literacy and numeracy tests were introduced in 1990 in our largest state, very controversially at the time. All of the other states gradually followed, and then finally the ministers all said, it makes no sense for us all to be using different tests. Why don't we use the same national tests of literacy and numeracy? And people have accepted that. So it was controversial when it started, but it's accepted now. The public reporting of those on the My School website is controversial. But that website is now being used by all sorts of people when they want to make arguments in favour of some change. They draw on the site and its evidence to substantiate their claim. So it's just, people often resist change when it first comes and then gradually embrace it. We have government schools run by the states. There are no national schools and there are no municipal schools. The government schools are all run by the states. And then we have non-government schools of two kinds. There are Catholic schools, and there are some small systems, like there are some Lutheran schools, but the rest we just call independent schools. So we've got independent Catholic and government. And more than 30% of students, about 1/3 of students, go to non-government schools.
Because they are better, is that?
Well, they go for a number of reasons. They might go because they're Catholics and they want their children to go to a Catholic school, or they want their children to go to some other kind of Christian school or to an Islamic school. In some cases it's because they think if you pay for it, it's going to be better, because they have to pay fees. All of our non-government schools get government money, actually, as well. And one of the things we now publish on the My School website is how much money every school has. So you can look at a school and see how much money it's got from the government, from the parents, and from other sources of income. And you can see what its results are. And in some cases you can see a government school with similar students with much less money does just as well. And then the parents say, why am I spending all this money? The traditional pattern in Australia has been to stay within your state, partly because the school system is the state system, not a national system. The exams are the state exams, and the universities know those exams, and students move on to universities within the state. And the universities are mostly in the capital cities, not all. So increasingly, some students move interstate, but it's mostly been within the state. But there's more than one university, and there's competition, and it's whether you get in, if you're entering directly from school, depends upon your results in the examinations at the end of school. But many students start university later than that. They don't come immediately from school.
Between when finish the school and go to university, they take a year.
Some just take a year out. That's so-called, in English we often call it the gap year. But those are students who've won their place in the university and then say to the university, we'll take it up next year, not this year, and their place is held for them. But there's a whole lot who don't choose to go to university when they leave school, but choose later to go. So once I think it was much more likely in Australia that almost everyone who went to university came straight from school. That's not true now. There are differences among the universities, but they tend not to be among the universities in the different states. They tend to be among the universities within the state. So there is one group of universities that calls themselves the Group of 8. These are the original universities. And there's one in each capital city except for Hobart, and there are 2 in Sydney and 2 in Melbourne. And they're all ranked high in the international rankings. 3 of them are in the top 100, Sydney, Melbourne and the Australian National University. So a student's not disadvantaged if they grow up in Brisbane and go to the University of Queensland compared with someone in Sydney going to the University of Sydney or the University of New South Wales.
Professor, I would like to talk a little bit about the students. I was reading an interview of yours, and you were talking about the 21st century schools and the students of our century. What's the difference between students from the last century, nowadays students?
Well, yes, it's interesting. When we started developing a national curriculum, we got all sorts of advice from people, some of whom said, you should organise the curriculum around what they called the 21st century skills, not around traditional knowledge domains like science, humanities, social science and so on, or even physics, chemistry, biology. And then you say, well, what are the 21st century skills? Well, some countries call them general competencies or general capabilities, and they usually say, well, it includes communication, capacity to work with other people, creativity, problem solving, and I usually say to them, so those skills weren't important in the 18th century or the 16th century. They're not new skills. They may take new forms in an environment where there's much more technology. So we communicate differently now from the way we used to. We work together with other people in different ways, not always even face-to-face. People work electronically together. So there are new forms of these skills. But in our view, you shouldn't organise the curriculum exclusively around them. So what we've done is to say, in the English curriculum, where could you develop creativity? In the science curriculum, even in the maths curriculum, in the history curriculum, where could you develop creativity? And then a teacher who's thinking, I'd like to focus on creativity in my teaching program for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatever, can look at our curriculum electronically, not as English, as maths, as science, but as creativity, and find where in grade 3, if that's what the teacher's teaching, it's suggested you could deal with issues of creativity in the different subjects, and then the teacher could develop a theme that integrates that. Now, it seems to us much better to think of it as embedding these skills in the curriculum and not saying, well, we've got all these subjects, English, maths, science, history, etc., and in addition, we have these other skills that sound like another set of subjects. Now, in some parts of Australia, that's the way it's been done. In some of the states, you almost have these alongside. Now, we've said, think of it as two dimensions. Think of the subjects this way, think of the capabilities that way, and the content can be looked at from one or the other.
I would like to know a little bit more also about PISA.
Yes?
How and when did the idea come from? Who was the creator?
Well, there have been international comparisons of students' performance in countries since the 1950s. And that work was done by a non-government organisation. It's got a very short acronym, IEA, but it has a very long name, the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. And they did maths, science, they even did a civic study back in the 1950s. They started with what they called the 6 subjects study. Then they repeated a number of them. There was a further science study, a second science study, a second math study, and then when they were going to do a third, they put those two together and produced the fairly well-known third International Maths and Science Study, which was in the 1990s. Now, around that time, OECD's education work was producing statistics on countries and indicators, but they were almost all focused on the inputs into the education system. How much did countries spend? What did they turn that money into? How many teachers did they have? Something about teachers per student. Some progression rates, like how many students finished secondary school, how many went to university, how many finished university, but nothing about the quality. And it was actually in those OECD Education Committee discussions that the Americans, I understand, put pressure on the OECD to begin to develop measures of outcomes. Now, not for the first time, as I said, because it had been done already for 40 years. So OECD developed its own program, which of course became known as PISA. And I was at the time head of the Australian Council for Educational Research, and we put together the international consortium that won the bid to conduct the work. So we developed the test with international collaborators. We did all the statistical analysis, but we won that bid in 1997, but then in 1998, I actually moved from Australia to Paris to be head of education at the OECD. So when the first PISA was done in 2000, I wasn't at the organisation doing the work. I was by then at the OECD. But that's its origin. It was new for the OECD, but not new for the world.
And how is Australia at PISA right now?
Well, in the first PISA, in reading, there was only one country significantly better than us, and that was Finland. And that was true again in 2003, but in 2006 there were 5. And the reason was 2 of those got better, South Korea and Hong Kong. The other three remained the same, which was New Zealand and Canada and Finland, but we declined. So we are one of only 4 countries that declined in reading between 2000 and 2009, and we're one of the countries, a bigger number, that declined in mathematics. We haven't declined in science. So this is another reason to think about a curriculum that raises our standards. So our maths curriculum, for example, we look carefully at the maths curriculum in Finland and in Singapore. And when we put it out as a draft for teachers to look at, many of them said, this is too hard for our students. And we said, that's what we intend. We intend the maths to be more demanding because it is less demanding than the countries that are doing better than us. And there's no reason why it should be.
How do you see the Brazil at the PISA?
Well, Brazil at least improved significantly on everything between its first occasion and most recently. So it's moving in the right direction. I mean, you're a very large country and a very diverse country, and your average is going to be affected by not just your best performance, but also the tail of your performance as well. So I think you just keep on doing whatever it is that produced the improvement you've already had. And it's not just a competition of will we get a better rank, because all of the countries might be getting better. And you can see if that's the case because the scale is constant. You can watch your movement on the scale. So I wouldn't despair.
I believe the education is much better now, right?
Yes, and there's a whole lot of associated things that are much better here. Your economic development is impressive. When I was leaving the OECD, we were already beginning to talk about the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India and China, as the emerging economies. Well, now you've come a long way even since then. I left the OECD at the end of 2005, and it's just impressive to me. The last time I came to Brazil was in maybe 2002, 2003. So, I mean, this country's moving. And it's not surprising your education's getting better because it's education that's going to drive the growth, as well as education improves as countries become wealthier, but countries become wealthier because their education's improving. Both things occur. There's a cause in both directions.
Would you be a Brazilian welcome to a university in Australia, for example?
Oh yes, we've got a very large number of international students, but we need to, and we are, internationalizing in another way. It's not just important to have students from other countries come to our universities, it's important that all of our students begin to think internationally about issues, particularly students in higher education. But even in the school curriculum, we've said that one important theme that should be developed through our school, primary and secondary curriculum is Asia and Australia's links with Asia. Because that's, I mean, we may be European in our origin, we're certainly not European in our population if you walk around the streets of Australia. There are many, many people who are Australians whose origin lay in different parts of Asia. And economically, our biggest trading partners are in Asia. So we think we've got to engage more with that part of the world as well as internationally more generally. And every country has to do that.
Professor, thank you for the interview. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.